The masters who carved no masks refused to sleep in the same room as their finished work, not because of superstition, because of what happened to the ones who did. You are about to look at a piece of carved wood. It has no muscles, no nerves, no moving parts, and yet, depending on the angle of light, it is smiling at you. Then it isn't. Then it is again. This is not a trick of the camera. This is 700 years of deliberate psychological engineering, and by the end of this video, you will understand why the men who built these things believed something was living inside them. Stay with me, because the most unsettling detail is not at the beginning of this story. It's buried in the middle, and most people never see it coming. We begin in Japan, 1433. A dying old man sits alone in a room. He has spent his entire life, 70 years, building something, not a temple, not a palace, something far smaller and far stranger. A collection of carved wooden faces, each one no larger than your own. His name is Zeami Motokyo, and what he built is still alive today. Zeami didn't invent no theater from nothing. The roots go back even further to a performance style called sarugaku, which literally translates to monkey music. It began as a wild, acrobatic folk ritual tied to rice harvests and prayers to gods in the early Heian period, nearly 1,200 years ago. Farmers performed it in fields, priests performed it in temples. It was raw, physical, and deeply connected to something the Japanese didn't have a clean word for, the feeling that the spirit world and the living world share the same air. Zeami's father, Kanami, took that energy and began shaping it, but it was Zeami himself who transformed it into something that would last. He added poetry, stillness, silence. He removed everything that was too human, too obvious, too easy to read, and most importantly, he added the mask. In 2001, UNESCO named No Theater one of the masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. 700 years old, and it is still performed today using the exact same techniques, the exact same stage positions, the exact same masks, some of them centuries old, worn by generations of actors who are now themselves ghosts. But here is the question nobody asks at the beginning of this story, the question that changes everything once you understand the answer. Why a mask at all? Hold that thought, because to answer it, we need to go somewhere most documentaries never go. In Shinto belief, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan, certain objects are not just objects. They are called shintai, physical bodies of divinity, containers where a kami, a spirit, chooses to reside. Mirrors, swords, ancient trees, mountains, and masks. The belief was not symbolic, it was literal. A carved mask, completed by a master craftsman and used in sacred performance, was understood to be an open door. Something could move in, and once it did, the mask was no longer wood and paint. It was a vessel, a body, a face with something behind it. This is why no actors, even today, do not say they wear a mask. The verb they use translates closer to don. The distinction matters. You wear a costume, you don a second self. Before a performance, the actor sits alone in a small room called the Kagami no Ma, the mirror room. He studies the mask in silence, not to memorize it, not to rehearse, to let it absorb him, to feel, as one master described it, the emotion already living inside the wood begin to transfer into his own body. Then the mask is tied to his head, and his own face disappears. What walks onto the stage is no longer the actor. That is the entire point. Now, if you think that sounds like a metaphor, like poetic language used to describe performance craft, keep watching, because what I'm about to show you about the masks themselves will make you reconsider that assumption entirely. The wood used is Japanese cypress, hinoki, a tree considered sacred in Japan for over 1,000 years, used to build the country's most important Shinto shrines. The choice of material was never random. A master carver begins with a single block and works inward using increasingly fine chisels, rough cuts first, then refinement, then a process of layering the surface with 15 to 20 coats of powdered oyster shell mixed with deer bone glue. Each coat is polished before the next is applied. Horsehair is sometimes embedded into the surface. The outer finish is deliberately aged, chipped, worn, so that even a newly completed mask looks like it has already lived several lifetimes. From start to finish, a single mask takes a master approximately 1 month to complete. 1 month for a face that, technically, has no expression. And that is where it gets strange. The expression of a no mask is deliberately, precisely, mathematically ambiguous. The carvers called it a medium expression, engineered to resist any single emotional reading. It is not happy. It is not sad. It is something suspended in between, hovering in the space where those two states bleed into each other. But here is the mechanism that has haunted everyone who has ever studied these objects closely. When the actor tilts the mask slightly upward, a technique called terasu, more light falls across the carved features, and the face appears unmistakably to smile. When the face tilts slightly downward, kumarasu, the mask falls into its own shadow and appears unmistakably to weep. Joy. Grief. From the same frozen face, from nothing but the angle of light. One master carver described it this way: the better the mask, the more the expression changes with a slight difference in angle. A poorly made mask shows you one thing. A masterpiece shows you everything simultaneously and lets the darkness decide which emotion you see. Now ask yourself, who figured that out? Who sat down in 1400 and something and engineered a human face specifically to exploit the way shadow interacts with grief? The answer to that question is connected to something the masks were always really for, and we are almost there. But first, I need to tell you about the one mask that crossed the line between ancient art and modern nightmare, the one that was never supposed to make you feel safe to begin with. Of all the masks in No Theater, and there are over 450 recognized types, one has crossed the boundary between ancient art and modern nightmare more than any other. The Hanya is a woman's face, or rather, it is what a woman's face becomes. She begins as a human being, beautiful according to the stories, devoted, and then she is betrayed. And the jealousy that follows doesn't just hurt her, it transforms her. The Hanya mask shows the precise moment of that transformation. Metallic eyes, two sharp horns pushing through the forehead, a mouth stretched wide enough to show the teeth of something that is no longer entirely human. But here is what makes the Hanya genuinely terrifying rather than simply grotesque. The mask is designed to show both states at once. She is the demon and the woman simultaneously. The rage and the grief are inseparable. Actors who have spent decades performing No say the Hanya is the hardest mask to inhabit, not because of the physical demands, but because you must hold both states in your body at the same time. Terror and heartbreak at the same time. There is no Western theatrical tradition that asks this of a performer. The Hanya is not a villain. She is a portrait of what love looks like when it has nowhere left to go. Now I want to tell you about the masks that nobody sees. The oldest No mask in documented tradition is kept as a hidden treasure by the Kanparu school, the oldest surviving No lineage in Japan. According to the current head of the school, the mask was carved by Prince Shotoku himself, the legendary regent who lived from 572 to 622, over 1400 years ago. Whether that specific claim is provable is almost beside the point. What matters is this: the mask has never been publicly displayed. It is kept in a locked container handled by almost no one, and treated not as an artifact of cultural heritage, but as something that requires ongoing protection. Not preservation, protection. The oldest masks in museum collections date from the early 1500s. One conservator reported spending 22 hours on a single mask during restoration. The most complex cases took over 5 times longer than the simplest. These objects were built to outlast the people who made them, and they have by centuries. But the tradition that produces them is breaking. Fewer artisans enter the field every decade. The tools, the materials, The intuitive knowledge of how cypress responds to a chisel at 3 in the morning after 15 hours of work. That knowledge lives in human hands, and human hands are finite. If the last masters disappear without passing what they know, a technology for capturing something in wood disappears with them. That word, technology, is not an accident. And this is where the story stops being ancient history and becomes something that should genuinely unsettle you about right now. In 1970, a Japanese roboticist named Masahiro Mori proposed a theory he called the uncanny valley. The idea: the closer a human-made object gets to looking human without quite reaching it, the more deeply, viscerally unsettling it becomes. Not a little unsettling, profoundly disturbing in a way that is difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. Mori was writing about robots, but the engineers who later studied no masks to develop robots capable of reading human facial expressions discovered something that stopped them cold. The no mask carvers had been deliberately engineering the uncanny valley since the 14th century. The ambiguity, the face that is almost human, almost smiling, almost weeping, was not a limitation of the craft. It was the entire point. They built the discomfort on purpose. They understood, without the language of neuroscience, that a face which cannot be fully read cannot be fully dismissed. It holds your attention because your brain refuses to file it away as understood. You cannot look at a great no mask and feel finished looking at it. That is not an accident. That is the design. No was performed at Kofukuji Temple in Nara in the year 869 during Buddhist ceremonies to pray for national prosperity. A senior priest described those earliest performances as containing many mystical elements because they were performed by priests to thank Buddha for warding off evil. The masks were not decoration. They were the mechanism, the technology by which the living could speak to what was on the other side. In 1647, the shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu issued a decree. No variations were allowed in no performance. Stage directions were written down. Costumes and masks were clearly defined. Actors were locked into fixed positions. Every gesture, every angle, every tilt of the mask that would bring light to the face or shadow to the eyes, frozen in time on purpose, because the people in charge understood something that took the rest of the world centuries to relearn. If you change the vessel, you risk losing what is inside it. No actors still begin training as young as 3 years old. For most of its history, all roles were performed by men. It was not until the 1940s that women began to perform. The knowledge moves from body to body, generation to generation, in an unbroken line that stretches back 700 years, and somewhere in that line, in a room you will never enter, in a locked container that has not been opened in decades, a mask is waiting. It has no muscles, no nerves, no moving parts. It has outlasted every person who ever carved a face like it, every actor who ever tied it to their head and let their own face disappear, every audience that ever sat in silence watching something they could not fully explain move across a wooden stage. It is still here. You have been watching this video for nearly 20 minutes. Think about how many times the light shifted while you were looking at it. Think about whether it was smiling at you or watching you watch it. The masters who built these things believed the answer was both, and after everything you have just learned, you are not entirely sure they were wrong.